Welcome back to the Banderpod, the sagacious and serendipitous podcast of Bandersnatch Books. We're a small press publisher of treasures found off the beaten path for lovers of all that is good, true, and beautiful. I'm Rachel Donahue, and today I'm conversing with poet Ben Palpant about, conversations with poets. Ben is also a memoirist and a storyteller and the author of many books, two of which are from Rabbit Room Press. Letters from the Mountain, which is chock full of sound wisdom on writing and life, and his newly released title, An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. Ben Palpant, welcome to the Banderpod.
Thanks for having me. I'm so honored to be here. I'm a huge fan of everything Bandersnatch.
Oh,
So good work.
thanks. Well, we're a fan of your work as well, so it's really exciting to get to have this conversation today. So, to get us started, why don't you give our listeners a bit of your background on who you are and how you came to poetry?
The short version is this. When I was a kid, I thought poetry was either a joke or a way to get kids to fail a quiz in school. And I held that view, even though I was an English teacher. I taught poetry, but it was not something I loved. I knew all the rules, or I tried to know all the rules about poetry, but I still had that little kid in me that thought this is some kind of cosmic riddle. But it was really when I had a health crisis that took me out for an extended amount of time, and I really had to wrestle with, who is God and what has he made me to do when I can't do all of those things that I thought I should do. Someone gave me some poetry at the time, and I found that it went through the cracks in my life that were those fissures that were opening up in my heart. And poetry was the only thing that really had access to my heart at that time. I wasn't in any shape to read some long theological treatise. And so poetry cut to the chase more. And there's so many layers to it that sometimes just a line of poetry, you don't need an entire poem. Sometimes it's just a line that hits you at the right time. So I came, I guess, through the back door, and to this day, and when you introduce me as a poet, there's a part of me that says, no, you have the wrong person. Who's talking about? So yeah, I just feel swept up in this beautiful story of my life that I just never would have planned for myself. If you'd told that kid back in 8th grade that he'd be spending his 40s and 50s talking to poets and writing poetry, I probably would have kicked you in the shins and lit out for the hills. But it's been so enriching. And I think that sometimes God uses those valleys of the shadow of death in our lives that we just think this is the end of things. It's really often a beginning.
Yeah.
Certainly was for me. I wouldn't be a writer today without that. And I wouldn't certainly have entered the world of poetry and had these relationships with these friends that I'm so honored to call friends and now have a book out. It's incredible.
Yeah, that's amazing. They use a line of T.S. Eliot who said, every end is a new beginning.
That's right.
And we went through a tough season as well. And that was the one most hopeful thing that a friend said in that hard season was, this is not the end of the story. It's just the turning of a page to a new chapter.
That's right.
And we kind of held on to that. And it was so true. Like God had a lot of good in store for us beyond those hard things. So
I had a friend who told me that during that time, he said, don't despise the chrysalis. And if you open that chrysalis early, then the transformation doesn't have the strength. It doesn't have what it needs to actually survive. So that has been a poetic piece of advice I think is just priceless. And I have to remind myself regularly when I'm feeling like this is just goo, that God is at work. He's always at work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. So part of your background, you grew up in Kenya. I'm curious to hear more about that and how that has shaped who you are and your work.
It has more bearing on my life than I probably know. I went there when I was 5 and came back when I was almost 11 years old. So pretty formative years.
Yeah.
Dad was a missionary doctor and a very small rural hospital. So it was a family ministry. All the kids were part of ministering to the patients and to their kids. And I would play Legos regularly with the patients. And When I tell people I grew up in Kenya now, they think, wow, what a romantic childhood. But I mean, it's just dirt paths and it's bare feet and you don't have any toys. And you turn a stick into, put a stick in the ground and you're like, hey, look, it's a gear shift. We can pretend to drive a car. And so it's very unromantic when I was in it.
Mm,
And at the same time, I think formed me in ways that there's no way to say thank you enough.
mm, mm-hmm.
So some of that has formed my poetic leanings, and probably, because it was middle of nowhere. I remember having a friend over from the States, and we were playing out in the yard, and I heard this distant hum in the sky, very distant. You could barely hear it. And I said, come on, we've got to get on the roof and sit back. This is the best moment of the day. So I climbed on the roof. He had no idea what was going on. We lay down on the roof and I look up in the sky and I'm searching with all my might. And there in the far distance is this tiny little speck. It's this airplane. And I was like, look at that. It's an airplane. Well, this poor guy, I mean, he grew up next to an airport. So he
Wow.
was totally dumbfounded my amazement. But it was that rural. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that kind of quiet has calibrated my
Mm,
whole personhood so that in some respects I don't actually feel at home
mm,
until I find a place that is pretty much that quiet.
mm,
And the term third culture kids
mm-hmm.
is something I just discovered in the last few years, but oh, it's real.
Yeah. Oh, it very much is. And it doesn't matter which culture.
Right.
All third culture kids have a lot of
Yeah.
those things in common. And
Yeah.
it sounds like the attention and love you received, you are then passing on to other people. Like I get that tone from the interviews that you've done with poets in this book. So let's talk about the book. You've done interviews with 17 poets, correct?
Correct. Yeah. Amazing, amazing
Yeah,
people.
some incredible names, people that it would just be a dream to sit down and have a conversation. And then we get to be a fly on the wall and hear your conversation with them. First of all, tell us, how did you come to do these interviews?
Well, Rabbit Room asked me if I was interested in interviewing some poets for their blog.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, sure. So I went to Seattle because Scott Cairns is in Seattle and Lucy Shaw is in Seattle,
Mm-hmm.
Misha Willette, and thought, well, I'll just start with three and see how it goes. So I was probably on the second interview, and early in that interview that I thought, I'm I'm sitting in a gold mine here, and it's really not me. I think this is one of the misconceptions that can come when you read somebody's book. You start thinking maybe, especially a book like this one, that it has my name on the front cover. But really, the richness of this thing is not so much Ben Palpant, so much as I've found people who were so gifted by God. And all I had to do is push play and say, go. And I think I tried to make it as narrative as possible in the book so it doesn't feel like an interview book.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want it to sound like, here's my question, here's your answer. I wanted it to sound like two people really hanging out together,
Mm-hmm.
because poets have this amazing gift of making us more human. And so I wanted to transfer that feeling. It was both a treat and it was also terrifying at the same time because I just was trying to keep up. I mean, you get Malcolm Guite going.
I know. Just
My
set him talking.
goodness.
You're furiously scribbling notes the
Let
entire
him
time.
talking. That's right. So but they were all so unique in many respects. The variety of the personalities is part of the joy. The variety of their kinds of poetry, they're all very different,
Mm-hmm.
but they all confirm certain core beliefs.
Mm.
I Part of the preparation for this was I wanted this to be an interview that they found interesting.
Mm.
And some of them have been interviewed hundreds of times. So my homework that I gave myself was to read as many and watch as many of the interviews as possible
Mm.
for each of these poets so that I could ask them things they wouldn't be accustomed to being asked. And I think that homework proved to have a big payoff because then they're actually being asked something that they're not used to being asked.
Mm.
And so that was a little nerve-wracking to approach some of these poets and say, here's what I'm thinking we should talk about. knowing that, they've got incredible influence and ideas that are totally worth exploring. And here I'm wanting to talk about their land and Dana Joya, who has been interviewed by everybody. And reading and watching his interviews, I realized there's this little untouched corner of his life that is his property. And it's this beautiful place that he'll mention in interviews periodically, but it seemed to me that there was a richness there that was untapped because everyone's trying to talk to the intellectual or the cultural persona rather than to the person. And Dana was so excited about that on our pre-conversation phone call, he said, "Come with me. Let's go outside." And I heard him crunching on the gravel. And he said, "You got to come. I've got to check my bluebird nests." He's trying to recover the bluebird population after all these fires in California.
Yeah.
Just so rich, Rachel, to talk to these people as people. Not only is poetry accessible, it's also written by very human people, and their struggles are our struggles, but sometimes God gives them a little insight that they actually didn't concoct. It's something that comes to them and they're stewarding that.
Yeah.
So,
oh, I like that word, that stewarding. I think I particularly appreciated that conversation with Dana Joya because place and the land that we're on it really resonates deeply with me. And it made him, like you said, just approachable. Like he's just another person loving the place where he is, and poetry is part of how he does that. And
yeah, and it doesn't dilute the fact that these poets have had humongous cultural influence and that they're worthy of admiring truly for their canon of work.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So looking back on this body of interviews with all of these different poets, what are some things that stand out to you?
It's an overwhelming question, Rachel, because every single interview was so profoundly unique and
Mm,
humbling. So each one carried its own surprises, right? There are these moments. I think it was W.H. Auden who said poetry is gratuitous utterance.
mm,
Well, every single one of these interviews was gratuitous utterance. So, even with a Morris Manning, who is a very quiet country boy, and I love him for it, even with somebody like that, there are these profound insights into the effects of the world upon us. What does it mean to walk among the trees?
mm.
And what does it do to us? So, with his students, he says, you want to write poetry? Great. You're going to need to learn the names of trees and flowers first. And then you're going to get to walk outside and get to know them. Well, that's a lost art. I mean, we're surrounded by concrete and brick and
Yeah.
asphalt. And so to realize that I really have lost something if I don't know the names of these fellow
Mm,
inhabitants of the world that God put here with me. And it's just for me another variation of grass or another variation of flower.
mhm.
It changes your perspective when you know the name of something, right?
Yeah.
So I feel a real lack in that respect, even after having that conversation with Morris. But I would add that if I were to find a common theme, one of them is that these poets all agree that poetry is not about self-expression,
Mm, mhm,
which is I, I grew up with that as the definition of all art, not just
mm,
poetry. But poetry for me was like, oh, okay, there we go. The reason I don't understand this is that it's just self-expression and it's gobbledygook, right? But
mhm,
they all agree this is not about self-expression. It's, as I read somebody today, they said self-expression might be the beginning of art, but
mm,
it's barely the beginning.
mm,
There's so much more profundity and stewardship involved. And God equips us for the work that he calls us to do, whether that's painting or fiction writing or
mm,
podcasting or whatever it is. Everything is preparation for the next thing.
mm,
And these poets all agree. There's so much more to this than simply self expression. The other thing they all agree with is that poetry it resists reduction. So you really can't approach a poem and say, summarize the poem for me, because the poem is itself,
It is.
right? So it's both what it's saying and how it's saying it.
Yeah.
Lee Young Lee, he said in a different interview, I believe, but he said, people who read poetry have heard about the burning bush, but poets are called to sit inside the burning bush. I mean, you can just call it quits there and
Right.
meditate on that, right?
Yeah.
But every single one of these poets has accepted the great call of God to sit in that burning bush, whatever that is,
Hmm.
and then to tell us about that experience in a very, very intimate, visceral poetry.
Yeah. So, what kind of impact have these conversations had on you personally?
The fact that I got to talk to people I've read for years and have idolized, I hope, in the best ways possible. The fact that Scott Cairns let me sit in his basement sunroom there on a wicker chair, and he's amazing with his pun jokes. He loves that. So his humor is great. And here there's no pretense. I really, really love those moments. And Lee Young Lee, I say this in the book. He's the only one who's visited me in a dream of any author ever. And I taught English for 20 years. But during that health crisis, I carried around Lee Young Lee's book, The Rose,
Hmm.
because I couldn't read. The brain just was not accepting it. And I was having a hard time walking. So I had this half-mile loop that I walked in my neighborhood, and I carried that with me. And I would read one line of poetry and
Hmm.
let the brain absorb it in all of its 5 dimensions. Sometimes a line of poetry can carry so many layers of meaning.
Hmm.
And then I would move to the next line. So it was very childlike. But that season of meditating on Lee Young's poetry proved to be priceless in my formation as a human being and as a poet myself. So then to have to see him walking up to the park in Chicago to talk to me was very surreal,
Hmm.
because he's just somebody I don't know. He would chastise me. If he heard me saying how amazing he is, he'd have some fatherly word for me. But then to have him, I get choked up just thinking about. It was a very sunny day, Rachel, and we were in this little park, and it got really noisy, so we could hardly hear each other. And we're talking about poetry. It's hard to shout about
Right.
poetry. So we took a walk, and the sun was beating down, and I noticed he'd carried an umbrella with him, and I wasn't wondering if it rained in Chicago randomly. But while we're walking, the sun starts beating down, and he pops this open and raises it over my head and says, "This is just something I do." And here is this man I've admired for a very, very long time. I studied his poetry in college,
Hmm.
and he's holding an umbrella to shield the sun from me, little old me. What a what a humble gesture. And I would say across the board, that was one of the great treats of these interactions, was just to know that they felt as honored as I felt that we could have this conversation together.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, that's really good. It has to be a very profound experience getting to sit across the table from the people you admire and whose work has an impact.
Yeah, profound is the right word.
I had read some of these conversations as they were being released on the poetry Substack, but I was really glad to hear that they were going to be compiled into a book, because there's something about the format of a book, of having it in print, having something you can return to, and these nuggets of wisdom, these conversations and moments that are captured that we can return to and ponder and glean from in moments. I think this is going to be a book that I go back to, and I'm really glad that it exists, that it's in print. What do you hope people come away from with this book?
I think your comment that this is a profound experience for me, I hope it's a profound experience for them. I hope that it's got enough variety and insight and gold nuggets that it can do what poetry often does, which catches us at a particular time in our life, and we just go, wow, that is exactly what I needed.
Mm.
So it's not like every interview is going to knock everybody's socks off, but I think there are God meets us where we are, and I think this book is tailor made for that encounter. Yeah, I think the profundity of it, I truly do feel like I've been swept up by a wave that was not of my own making.
Mm.
Even, you start with three poets and then they recommend other poets, and then you just sort of follow this little trail of seeds and you go, okay, let's see what happens here. So I know that early on I thought, gosh, if this continues, after talking to Scott Cairns, if this continues this way, then I would love this to be a book for myself, because I know we live in a digital world and most of that's so disposable.
Mm.
But I don't think I'm being too romantic to say that I think the book format is not dead. I think people still long to be able to go to their shelf and say, here's that book, and here are my underlines, here's the marginalia, and
Yeah.
here's what I was thinking at the time, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that I hope is a takeaway for readers is the joy with which these poets enter their work, and also the way how they relate to life.
Mm.
So one of my favorite Scott Cairns poems ends this way. This is Idiot Psalm 2, a psalm of Isaac. And Scott Cairns has a really great sense of humor, which is very wry and shows up in his poetry a lot. But the ending of Psalm 2 ends this way: Make me to awaken daily with a willingness to roll out readily, accompanied by grateful smirk, a giddy joy, the idiot's undying expectation, despite the evidence. Rachel, that's me. I wrote, as soon as I saw that years ago, I put that in my journal and I would just go back to it because the evidence says there's no reason to wake up hopeful or joy filled. It doesn't take any work at all to take that ledger, that side of the ledger, and create such a length of reasons not to have hope. And here, Idiot Psalm is just saying, Lord, help me to wake up and fill the other side of that ledger with reasons that far outnumber the other side if we just pay attention to it, right? So
Yeah.
he's recounting at the end of that. I said, thank you for that poem. What a gift that's been to me. And he said, well, I really wrote that to myself, because he said, I need that reminder, which honestly, that's what poets are doing. They're not really writing often for an audience. They're writing for themselves,
Yeah.
which makes it a little less about creating a riddle. Am I trying to summarize something that I can't summarize, or pass a quiz for a test? And it becomes more about, where is this person and
Mm.
where is their story overlapping with my own in such a way that I can stand in their shoes. Scott said that, when he was a boy, he still remembers a crisp winter night. He was just a little kid and they were at somebody else's house. He was maybe 3 or 4 years old. And he says, I was early. I was ready early because I didn't have much to do. And so I walked out into a very crisp winter night and closed the door behind me. I stood on the threshold, my little feet on the doorstep. And as I looked up into the starry sky, I had this exhilarating sense of joy, of beauty. I said out loud, I love life. The expression of an earnest young person. But that has stuck with me. It was this huge blessing, this realization that it's all okay now and ever. It was a moment that set me up for resistance against the despair that would woo me later in life.
Mm.
I've carried that little anecdote pretty much every day, and I want to be that little boy the rest of my life. However long God has me in the world, I want to approach even my deathbed with
Mm.
that little boy's mentality. And that is hard work. That's not going
Yeah.
to happen by default. That's going to happen by me waking up every day and saying, Lord, Give me eyes to see the way you see, and give me a heart of gratitude.
Mm, mm, that's good. So that takes me to my next question. And that was one of the things I appreciated about the book is that poem at the end of each section. So you kind of like the capstone at the end of the conversation is a poem. And often it's a poem that was referenced in the conversation, but not always. Did you select those poems, or was it a conversation with the poet about which poem they'd like to select?
Yeah. I think that we decided to ask them if they wanted to give us something that had not been printed before.
Mhm.
And that would give a layer to this book that was more than interviews. It'd be its own book of poetry. So some of them did submit work that was unpublished. And goodness, what an honor to receive those from these incredible poets. Some of those I selected and some of those I vetoed, not because they weren't good, they were all incredible, but because there were some that I felt really needed to be the poem that reflected either the tone of the interview or the poet, him or herself. And so it's a bit of a mix. So, some of them, like Lee Young Lee's From Blossoms, is one I read a long, long time ago,
Mm.
but it moved me so much that I just thought I have to have this in this book. If my name's going to be on the front, I'm going to choose that poem. And so Lee Young Lee was kind enough to let me do so.
That's wonderful.
Morris Manning sent me an original. I love Morris Manning's work. There are so many poems that I really, really adore. He sent me this one, and it wowed me. I don't even know how to highlight this because to pick this out is to imply that the others didn't wow me, but every one of them did.
Mhm.
So I'm sort of turning at random here and picking this, but I'll read it out loud. This is called Morning and Evening. I Shall Drink the Dew by Morris Manning. It's not an effort, but a fact that time stops being time, and there's nothing left to realize because the mind at last belongs to the landscape where it is, like the root of an ironwood tree, plunging into the spongy ground with moss and sorrel and nameless green above, and warbling bird song singing before first light. There's nothing for the mind to think, nothing to do, and no awareness to piddle with. Now, that's one of the biggest follies ever to stroll in the shade of folly, to be aware to the point of being too aware. You have to forget yourself and belong to a world you grasp imperfectly and partly as a dream that's not your dream at all. It's where the loved ones all have gone. Your father's horse, the storytellers and those in the story, the singing voice you've always heard, the rivers, the woods, the green, the birds, the beginning and end of you and time. And then you make it rhyme. Rachel, that is so moving to me.
So good.
I just can't believe that I get to have that in this book. And every poem in here is that kind of caliber.
Yeah. Yeah, they really are. I'm glad for this collection, if for nothing else than to discover new poets. There are some of these names are people that I knew, and then some of them I was not familiar with or have just recently become familiar with. And I get another taste of their work and think, oh, I need to go deeper. I need more of this.
Good. Glad
So
that's true.
I hope people get this book and enjoy the riches of it, but then also that it's a starting place. It is not an end, but a beginning,
That's right.
and
I really
takes them
hoped
deeper.
I hoped it would be a doorway into the world of poetry. It is such a big, big, beautiful world full of
Hmm.
incredible people. And all of these poets recognize their place in history and they know they're not the end. They're certainly not the beginning. They're stepping midstream into something really beautiful. It's an ongoing conversation that they love to participate in. And I think they're also calling us to participate in it. There's a way in which we can start thinking of published poets as the people who have the right to write poetry, but that's not really true. I think it was Shelley. I read in a recent article, it is in our nature to be poetic. And some people practice it more than others, but we're all poets. It's something that God has put in the hard wiring for us. And so
Mm,
I think we just get to practice that. And whether we actually put down a line of poetry or not is not so much the point. But even if we do, those little steps, God says, do not despise the day of small beginnings.
that's right.
My goodness, I don't know what would have happened to Ben Palpant's life if I had early on said, well, I guess this isn't for me. It's just too hard and I don't
Mm,
understand it. But thankfully, he brought people into my life who could take me by the hand and walk that little ignorant kid along and say, here, look at this. Isn't this beautiful? And
mm,
by his Holy Spirit, I was able to go, yeah, that is something I recognize something there that is beautiful.
mm, that's good stuff. Well, before we end our conversation, we usually wrap up our conversation with some popcorn questions. And these are just fun questions with short, quick answers. For the first one, what's your favorite word?
Okay, so first of all, let me just say that this takes me right back to high school and it feels like I'm having a pop quiz. So I'm stressing out right now.
There are no wrong answers.
Okay, yeah, well, what will happen is that I'll get done with this and I'll go, why didn't I say that word? That word is awesome. Okay, first word comes to mind. This is one that Scott Cairns said in his interview. All these poets are so much smarter than I am. They're dropping words that I had to go look up. But he loved the vertiginous effect of poetry. Vertiginous. And I found that word so
Vertiginous.
beautiful.
What is
I don't
vertiginous?
know. Look it up. Vertiginous.
All right, we'll
No,
go
no,
look
no.
it up.
Here. I want to say that it's a form of vertigo. So
Oh,
it's a
okay.
yeah, it's a
Ah,
dizzying
okay.
effect of a line of poetry. You come to the end, the brain automatically assumes it knows what the next line is going to start with.
Yeah.
But a good poet will turn that on its head or twist it in some way or play with the words in such a way that it gives you pause. And he says that's the dizzying, vertiginous
Ah,
effect of poetry.
ooh, that's a good word. I like that.
Okay, I passed
All
one.
right, pass number one. All right, what is the strangest thing you've ever eaten?
Probably fried ants, I suppose. We
Ooh,
we would have fried ants when we were little. They were little
wow.
snacks. They sound disgusting when I say that out loud, but high protein diet.
Interesting. That's it. I've never tried fried
I'm
ants.
not recommending it.
All right. If you could vacation in any fictional world, where would you go?
Tricky part of this question is that I love literature so much and fiction in particular, but there are so many of those places I would just never want to go. I just want to read about them.
Right, yeah.
Don't take me there. There's too much hardship. Okay, so I'm going to cheat. I have my first attempt at children's fiction coming out in August
Wonderful.
called Bright Wing Tales.
Oh, cool.
And it's a Wind in the Willows kind of style book. And it is born out of our 10 acres that we own. One day, my daughter and I were washing the dishes together, and she said, Dad, why don't you write a story about Brightwing? And I had never intended to write children's stories, but I didn't have a choice in this moment. Before I even had a chance to respond, I had two pictures in my head, and they were full three-dimensional pictures. One was of Mr. Mole in a robe and slippers smoking a pipe. And the next was Mr. Rabbit decked out for winter, full snow cap and big woolen coat and boots. And I thought, where did those come from? And who are these creatures? So then I had no choice. I find in my writing that it's not so much me generating something as much as something coming to me and then having to figure out how to steward that idea.
Yeah.
So I wrote a story about Mole's misadventure, which started because he ran out of pipe tobacco. He was smoking his pipe so vigorously because he was imagining himself as a great warrior. And then he realized he had no pipe tobacco. And so he had to go to visit his friend Rabbit's house in the middle of winter, Christmas Eve at night, which is a dangerous proposition for any mole. And that misadventure leads to this entire story with all sorts of wonderful characters. Little Freckles is the only human character who knows how to speak to the animals. And the reason she can is because she knows how to break open the hills by singing. And so if there was any place I would like to go vacation, it would probably be my 10 acres.
I love that. That sounds like an amazing story. And when is it coming out?
August.
In August. Okay, wonderful. We're going to have to keep our eye out for that one. All right, so last question. So our thing is we enjoy finding treasures found off the beaten path. So is there a poet or a book that is off the beaten path that you would recommend to us and our listeners?
The book that I would recommend is Unreasonable Hospitality by Will Guidara. It has changed a lot in my life. It talks about his journey from being a guy who just loves to cook to creating one of the great restaurants in the world. And how did he go about doing that? Well, I would immediately suspect that it comes from just fighting tooth and nail up that mountain of greatness and then coming up with the most expensive, most obscure kinds of dishes you can have and having some kind of experience that way. But his story is really of realizing that you reach greatness through hospitality and a heart's disposition that says, I love you and I really want to serve you, is a disposition in the hospitality industry that makes a ton of sense. And one of the things that I think writers often forget is that they are creating a little house that you want your readers to want to stay in, right? So it is a full experience. If it's a poem, you want the stanza, the line itself to be so hospitable. And that doesn't mean that it's always friendly, right? I will sit in the most hospitable of places and I'll be more inclined to receive correction in that space than in an inhospitable space. So I think it doesn't matter what genre we're in. If it's thesis, if it's blogging, if it's poetry, fiction, you're wanting the reader to find a hospitable place, and that requires that you have a hospitable heart.
Yeah.
And if you have a hospitable heart, then the way you phrase things is going to be less about making a name for yourself, which is where we tend to fall. Somebody just published my work. That's the driving cry. And we should flip it on its head and ask, how do I make something so beautiful that somebody wants to sit in this space with me? And then let God take care of a lot of those other things. God loves to open doors that you just never saw coming. But I do think that we need a revival of hospitality. And I don't necessarily mean that simply by having more people over to your house. I just think that that's a heart's disposition.
Yeah.
And it comes from being in a space that's grateful. I'm so grateful to be on this podcast with you, and you've made it so hospitable that it's just easy to talk. And you want to stay here for hours. So I wish people had that mentality with their writing as well. I think that would be a great gift to the world.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good word. That's a good word to end on. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us on the Vanderpod today.
Such a gift, Rachel. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. Well, listeners, may you find bookish treasures in your wanderings off the beaten path. Thanks for listening in to our conversation today on the Vanderpod. We hope you'll check out our full catalog at bandersnatchbooks.com. The Vanderpod is produced by Rachel S. Donahue, A.B. Donahue, and Carolyn Claire Givens. Audio engineering by SDG Morgan. Artwork by Evelyn Warnamundi. Many thanks to our friend Chris Slayton of Son of Laughter for our theme song, Cricket in a Jar. Find links and more in the show notes.